being executed for having tired hands, a death sentence for wearing glasses, being killed by the state for having a bad dream. These aren't plot points from a surreal movie. They were historical realities. The law books only tell half the story. The other half was an unwritten code of conduct where the punishment for a simple social mistake wasn't embarrassment. It was the end of your life. We are now entering the minefield of history's most lethal etiquette. 1. Imagine being at a political conference where Joseph Stalin has just finished a rambling 3-hour speech. The applause begins. It's thunderous, of course. But then it keeps going. And going. For 5, 10, even 15 minutes. Your palms are raw, your arms ache, but you can't stop. Why? Because somewhere in that sea of clapping communists, agents of the secret police are watching. Their only job is to see who stops clapping first. That person, the one whose physical endurance finally gives out, is clearly the least devoted to the cause. This simple act of physical exhaustion was logged as disloyalty, and it was enough to get you arrested in the dead of night and sent to a Siberian gulag. It was a terrifying, mandatory standing ovation where the price of a ticket was your life. 2. So, you've somehow secured a meeting with King Louis XIV, the self-proclaimed Sun King, in his ridiculously opulent palace of Versailles. The meeting concludes. Now what? You can't just say, "Thanks for your time," and walk away. That would mean turning your back on him, an unthinkable act of disrespect. The only acceptable way to leave his presence was to walk backward, bowing intermittently, until you were completely out of the room. This required immense spatial awareness, as you navigated priceless furniture and other bowing sycophants without looking. A trip, a stumble, or a clumsy turn could be interpreted as a grave insult to the man who believed he was the literal center of the universe. In his court, bad coordination wasn't just embarrassing, it was potentially treasonous. 3. In most societies, wearing glasses is a sign that you need help seeing. But in Cambodia, under the tyrannical Khmer Rouge regime in the late 1970s, it was a death sentence. Pol Pot's fanatical ideology, known as Year Zero, aimed to purge the country of all modern and intellectual influences to create a primitive agrarian utopia. Their method was to murder anyone deemed an intellectual. And how did they identify these enemies of the state? It was terrifyingly simple. If you spoke a foreign language, had soft hands, or wore glasses, you were marked for death. A piece of medical equipment designed to bring the world into focus became a symbol that instantly condemned you as a threat. It's a chilling reminder of a time when the simple act of having poor eyesight made you a political enemy. 4. We've all had to fake a laugh at a boss's terrible joke. Now, imagine your boss is the Roman Emperor Caligula, a man whose sanity was, let's say, questionable, and whose favorite hobby was random executions. When Caligula delivered a punchline, you didn't just laugh, you performed. You had to produce the most convincing, side-splitting, tear-inducing roar of laughter you could muster, even if the joke was painfully unfunny. A weak chuckle or a delayed reaction wasn't just awkward, it was a personal slight against the emperor's comedic genius. And for Caligula, any perceived insult was justification enough to have you dragged away and killed on the spot. It was the world's most dangerous comedy club, where the only one bombing was the audience member who didn't laugh hard enough. 5. You find yourself in the smoky, crowded longhouse of a powerful Viking chieftain. He raises a massive drinking horn filled with potent, cloudy mead and shoves it in your direction. The problem is, you're not thirsty. Or perhaps you're just not a fan of sharing backwash with an entire clan of bearded warriors. Saying no thank you is not an option. Refusing a drink was a catastrophic insult in Viking culture. It carried 2 deadly implications. Either you believed the chieftain was trying to poison you, or you considered his hospitality beneath you. Both were accusations against his honor that could only be settled with violence. So you drank. You chugged that questionable brew as if your life depended on it, because it absolutely did. Your choices were a hangover or a battle axe to the face. 6. The Mongols under Genghis Khan had a reputation for brutality, but they also had a surprisingly complex set of social rules. While they were famously unafraid to spill the blood of their enemies, spilling a drink in a Mongol's yurt was a far more serious offense. Their staple drink, kumis, a sour and alcoholic beverage made from fermented horse milk, was central to their culture of hospitality. To accidentally knock it over was not just clumsy, it was seen as a terrible omen that offended the spirits of the household and insulted your host's generosity. Depending on the Khan's mood, this simple party foul could escalate instantly from an apology to a death sentence. It was a culture where you had to be more careful with your cup than with your sword. 7. In 17th century England, the government's reach extended into the most private place imaginable, your own mind. Amidst extreme political paranoia, a law was passed that made it an act of treason to imagine the death of the king. This wasn't just about plotting an assassination. It literally meant that the very thought, or even a dream about the king's demise, was a capital offense. If you were foolish enough to wake from a nightmare about the king's death and tell someone about it, you could be arrested, put on trial for your subconscious thoughts, and executed. This turned every citizen into a potential thought criminal. It was the ultimate invasion of privacy, where you could be condemned not for what you did, but for what your sleeping brain accidentally conjured up. 8. In the vast Mongol Empire, the job of a royal messenger was arguably the most dangerous in the world. While bringing good news to Genghis Khan could result in great rewards, being the bearer of bad news was a certified death sentence. Khan operated under a bizarre and terrifying logic. If he killed the person who told him about a lost battle or a failed siege, perhaps the event itself could be symbolically erased. Messengers carrying reports of defeat knew that their journey's end would likely be their own. This created a system where information was either heavily censored or delivered by someone who had already accepted their fate. The phrase, "don't shoot the messenger," clearly hadn't reached the Mongol steppe, where it was less of a suggestion and more of a standard operating procedure. 9. In ancient Rome, fashion could be a fatal misstep, especially if you had a thing for purple. We're not talking about any old lavender, but Tyrian purple, a dye so obscenely expensive it was worth more than its weight in gold. To produce it, tens of thousands of sea snails had to be crushed for a single garment, making it the ultimate status symbol. This color was so exclusive that it became synonymous with the emperor himself. Only he could wear a solid purple toga. If some wealthy senator decided he was fabulous enough to rock the same outfit, it wasn't seen as a fashion faux pas. It was a direct political challenge. It was the ancient equivalent of walking into the Oval Office, sitting behind the desk, and putting your feet up. The punishment wasn't a slap on the wrist from the fashion police. It was execution for treason. 10. If you ever find yourself in Thailand, be very mindful of your feet. In Thai culture, the head is considered the most sacred part of the body, while the feet are the lowest and dirtiest. Pointing your feet at someone is the height of disrespect. But pointing them at a sacred object, like an image of the Buddha, or worse, at the king, that elevates a simple act of bad manners into a potentially capital offense. It's an insult of such magnitude that it can be interpreted as a malicious attack on the nation's spiritual and royal foundations. For centuries, this rule was enforced with deadly seriousness. So remember, while you might use your feet to walk, in Thailand, you better watch where you're pointing them, or you might not walk away at all. 11. Everyone knows the ancient Egyptians loved their cats, but this was far more than a simple affection for furry companions. Cats were considered divine beings, earthly manifestations of the goddess Bastet. They were protected by a religious law that was absolute. The penalty for killing a cat, even accidentally, was death. Imagine a chariot driver swerving and hitting one by mistake. There was no, "it was an accident" defense. Often, the driver wouldn't even make it to a trial. An enraged mob of citizens would descend upon them and carry out the sentence right there on the street. It was a world where taking the life of a sacred feline was considered a more heinous crime than killing a person from a neighboring country. 12. When visiting a Mongol yurt, the single most important rule was this: do not, under any circumstances, step on the threshold. To us, it's just a piece of wood at the bottom of a doorway. To the Mongols, the threshold was a sacred space, the home of the family's guardian spirits. Stepping on it was a profound act of disrespect, like spitting on a family's altar. It was a direct insult not only to the host, but to the spiritual protectors of his home. Foreign envoys and guests were explicitly warned about this rule, because breaking it, even out of ignorance, could have fatal consequences. Depending on the host's temper, this one clumsy step could be your very last. It's a stark reminder that sometimes the biggest dangers are hidden in the smallest customs. 13. The phrase, "no honor among thieves," is a complete lie when it comes to the golden age of piracy. Pirates were criminals, yes, but they lived and died by a strict code of conduct known as the ship's articles. This was their constitution, and one of its most sacred tenets was that you never, ever steal from a fellow crewmate. They were a brotherhood of outlaws, and betraying that trust was the ultimate sin. If you were caught pilfering from another pirate's share of the plunder, the punishment was swift and brutal. You might be marooned on a desolate island with a single pistol and one bullet, or simply find a cutlass lodged in your gut. They could steal from the entire world, but stealing from each other was a fatal mistake. 14. Serving in the army of Vlad the Impaler, the real-life inspiration for Dracula, was a terrifying prospect. He was a man obsessed with absolute order, control, and discipline, which he enforced with sadistic creativity. He demanded that his soldiers be immaculate at all times. If a soldier was found with a dirty or torn uniform, Vlad didn't just give him a stern lecture. He saw it as a sign of moral decay and a weakness in his army. His solution was typically gruesome. The offending soldier could be publicly impaled on a massive wooden stake as a terrifying lesson to the others. Keep your uniform clean, or you will become a permanent, agonizing piece of landscape art. It was perhaps the most extreme dress code violation in military history. 15. In Imperial China, making eye contact with the emperor was like staring directly into the sun. Both were considered blindingly powerful and incredibly dangerous. The emperor was not just a ruler. He was the Son of Heaven, a living deity whose divine nature made him too sacred for common mortals to look upon directly. To meet his gaze was an act of shocking arrogance. It implied you saw yourself as his equal, a direct challenge to the entire cosmic order. The proper etiquette was to keep your eyes fixed on the floor in his presence, a gesture of submission and reverence. Daring to look him in the eye was a quick way to be accused of treason and lose your head for your impudence. 16. In medieval England, going for a walk in the woods could get you executed. The king's royal forests were not public parks. They were his private, jealously guarded hunting preserves. The animals within, especially deer and wild boar, were considered the king's personal property. If a starving peasant was caught poaching a deer to feed his family, he wasn't just treated as a common thief. He was seen as stealing directly from the king, an act of high treason. The punishment was carried out by foresters who acted as judge, jury, and executioner. A poacher could be blinded, have his hands cut off, be castrated, or simply hanged from the nearest tree, no trial necessary. It was a brutal system where the life of a deer was valued far more than the life of a commoner. 17. In the lawless saloons of the American Old West, a man's reputation was often the only thing he truly owned, and it was defended with lead and gunpowder. Card games were a deadly serious business, a stage where fortunes and lives were won and lost. If you suspected another player was cheating, you had to be absolutely certain before making an accusation. Calling a man a cheat without irrefutable proof was a direct assault on his honor, an insult so grave that it couldn't be settled with an apology. It was a challenge that was almost always answered with a drawn pistol. The etiquette of the gambling table demanded that you either prove your claim or back it up with deadly force. Accusations were made not with words, but with the cold, hard finality of a gunfight at high noon. 18. No one approached the Sapa Inca, the god-king of the Inca Empire, empty-handed. It didn't matter if you were a high priest, a decorated general, or a foreign dignitary. The protocol was absolute. To enter his sacred presence, you were required to carry a symbolic burden on your back, known as a kaipai. This could be a small bundle of cloth or a few sticks, but its meaning was monumental. It was a physical representation of your humility and submission before the divine emperor. To appear before him without this burden was an act of unthinkable arrogance. It signaled that you saw yourself as his equal, a direct challenge to his authority. Such an insult was a capital crime, ensuring that your audience with the emperor would be your last. 19. Serving as a royal cupbearer to a Persian king was one of the most prestigious positions in the court, but it was also one of the most perilous. The king lived in constant fear of being poisoned, making the act of serving him wine a high-stakes ritual. The cupbearer didn't just pour and serve. He had to perform a precise, elaborate ceremony that included tasting the wine himself in the king's presence to prove it was safe. Skipping a step, fumbling the cup, or showing any sign of nervousness could be interpreted as a sign of guilt. In the paranoid world of the royal court, a simple mistake in the wine service wasn't just a breach of etiquette. It was seen as a poorly disguised assassination attempt, and the punishment would be immediate and excruciating. 20. The Aztec civilization believed their rituals were essential to maintaining the very balance of the cosmos. Their priests were not just religious leaders, they were cosmic engineers, and their ceremonies were complex and unforgiving. During a sacred ritual, every word, chant, and movement had to be perfect. To mispronounce the name of a god was a catastrophic error. It wasn't like flubbing a line in a play. It was seen as a cosmic disruption that could anger the deities and bring ruin upon the entire empire. The penalty for such a blunder was as severe as the perceived crime. The priest who made the mistake would often be offered up as a human sacrifice himself, his own heart cut out to appease the very god he had just offended and restore the sacred harmony he had broken. 21. In Thai culture, the head is considered the sacred vessel of the soul, the highest and most spiritual part of the body. You simply do not touch another person's head without permission. Now, amplify that belief by 1,000 when it comes to the King of Thailand. As a figure considered semi-divine, his head is the most sacred object in the entire kingdom. To touch it, even accidentally, was the ultimate act of defilement and disrespect. It was an instant act of treason, a crime so severe that the historical punishment was swift and certain death. This rule created an almost invisible force field around the monarch, a physical manifestation of his sacred status. It's a powerful reminder that in some cultures the lines between etiquette and existential threat are razor thin. 22. The Magi, the priests of ancient Zoroastrianism in Persia, revered fire and water as sacred, divine elements that must be kept pure at all costs. Their religious rituals were conducted with meticulous precision to avoid any form of pollution. A priest officiating a ceremony at a sacred fire altar had to wear a special veil over his mouth called a padan. This wasn't for fashion. It was to prevent his breath, spit, or a sudden cough from contaminating the holy flame. If a priest were to sneeze, cough, or even breathe too heavily on the fire, it was considered a sacrilege of the highest order. This act of accidental pollution was not forgiven with a simple, "Excuse me." It could result in the priest's execution for defiling the divine. 23. In North Korea, public displays of grief are not just expected, they are mandatory and aggressively policed. Following the deaths of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, the state demanded that every citizen participate in orchestrated, hysterical mourning. Citizens were watched by officials to ensure their performance was convincing. If your crying wasn't loud enough, if your tears didn't seem genuine, or if you failed to show the appropriate level of theatrical despair, you were marked as a political dissident. The punishment for insufficient grief was severe. You could be sentenced to years of hard labor in a brutal prison camp, or, in some cases, simply disappear forever. It's a terrifying world where your very survival depends on your ability to fake overwhelming sadness on command. 24. In ancient Athens, the olive tree was more than just a source of food and oil. It was a sacred gift from the city's patron goddess, Athena. The original olive tree she was said to have planted on the Acropolis, and all the trees propagated from it, were considered divine property. They were protected by law and religious taboo. To cut down or even damage one of these sacred trees was not just vandalism, it was a crime against the gods and the state itself. The penalty was death. Even during times of siege and starvation, when firewood was desperately needed, the sacred groves were left untouched. Harming one of Athena's trees was seen as an act that could bring divine wrath down upon the entire city, a risk that no Athenian was willing to take. 25. In imperial China, gift-giving was a treacherous art form, a complex social minefield where a single misstep could have deadly consequences, especially when dealing with powerful officials or the emperor. The etiquette was a razor's edge. Present a gift that was too cheap, and it would be seen as a grave insult to the recipient's status, implying they were worth little. Offer a gift that was too expensive, and it would be interpreted as a blatant bribe, an attempt to corrupt them. Even the object itself was fraught with peril. Certain items carried hidden, negative symbolic meanings. For example, giving a clock was a homophone for attending a funeral. Getting it wrong could mark you as insulting, corrupt, or just plain cursed, any of which could lead to your swift removal from public and mortal life. 26. In the unforgiving vastness of the Arabian desert, the Bedouin tribes lived by a code where hospitality wasn't just a virtue, it was the law of survival. Known as Bedou, this code dictated that any traveler, even an enemy, must be given food, water, and shelter. To refuse a stranger in need was the most shameful act imaginable, a stain upon the honor of the individual and their entire clan. But it was also incredibly dangerous. A person left to die of thirst in the desert had family, and that family would be honor-bound to seek blood revenge, or dhar. They would hunt you down relentlessly, and the resulting feud could last for generations. In the desert, sharing your last piece of bread wasn't just being nice, it was an insurance policy against a violent, honor-bound death. 27. When Spanish conquistadors first met the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma II, they were baffled by the strict and bizarre protocols required to enter his presence. Moctezuma was considered a living god, and the etiquette reflected this divine status. Before entering his throne room, every visitor, regardless of their rank, was required to remove their footwear. Walking barefoot before the emperor was a non-negotiable symbol of humility and submission. To keep your sandals on would be an act of supreme arrogance, a declaration that you considered yourself equal to a deity. This was not a minor fashion mistake. It was blasphemy. The punishment for such an insult was as